The calm before the storm. The late summer breeze filtered softly through the open windows of Lincoln High School. The air carried the scent of freshly mowed grass, mingling with the faint tang of the school's recently polished floors. It was the first week of the new academic year, and the building buzzed with the energy of students reuniting after a long summer break. Laughter echoed in the hallways, teachers exchanged polite greetings, and the faint squeak of sneakers on linoleum hinted at the organized chaos of the first week. Julia Carter, a seasoned English teacher in her early 30s, stood in her classroom, meticulously arranging her lesson plans. Her classroom was immaculate, every desk aligned with military precision. On the whiteboard, her neatly written agenda for the day highlighted the discussion of symbolism in modern literature. Julia prided herself on her ability to create order out of chaos, a trait she considered essential for navigating the unpredictable waters of high school education. As the final bell rang, signaling the start of third period, students shuffled into her classroom. Backpacks thudded against desks, chairs scraped noisily, and voices murmured about everything from summer adventures to the dreaded homework. Julia's eyes scanned the room, her sharp gaze cataloging each student. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she spotted Jamal Johnson entering the room with his usual unhurried stride. Jamal, a tall, lanky sophomore with an easy confidence, was known for his quick wit and even quicker hands. Today, he wore a faded blue hoodie with the school mascot emblazoned on the chest and a pair of well-worn sneakers. His ever-present smirk was firmly in place as he took his seat in the back row. Unlike the other students, who came prepared with notebooks and textbooks, Jamal carried only a single pen, which he twirled deftly between his fingers. Julia's grip on her clipboard tightened as she watched him. Jamal wasn't a troublemaker in the traditional sense. He rarely broke any major rules. Yet his subtle disruptions, like clicking his pen or making a clever comment at just the right moment, had a way of undermining her carefully cultivated authority. Today, she was determined not to let him derail her lesson. "Good afternoon, class," Julia began, her voice carrying the authoritative tone she had perfected over years of teaching. "Today, we'll be discussing symbolism and how authors use it to convey deeper meanings in their work." The students quieted, most pulling out notebooks and pens. Jamal leaned back in his chair, spinning his pen with practiced ease. The rhythmic clicking began, soft at first, but just loud enough to draw the attention of the students seated nearby. Julia's jaw tightened. She decided to ignore it, focusing instead on introducing the topic of the lesson. Symbolism allows writers to communicate complex ideas through simple images or objects, she explained, her voice steady despite the clicking in the background. For example, a storm in a story might symbolize conflict or chaos. As she turned to write examples on the board, the clicking grew louder. A few students stifled giggles, their eyes darting toward Jamal. Julia took a deep breath, silently counting to 3 before turning back to face the class. "Jamal," she said, her tone calm but firm, "would you mind putting the pen down so we can all focus on the lesson?" Jamal paused mid-spin, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Of course, Miss Carter," he replied smoothly, his voice carrying just a hint of amusement. He set the pen down with exaggerated care, his smirk deepening as a few students exchanged glances. "Thank you," Julia said, turning back to the board. But as she resumed her explanation, she heard it again. Click, click, click. Her patience, already worn thin, began to fray. The lesson continued, but the tension in the room was palpable. Jamal's pen spinning had become a performance, drawing subtle attention from his peers. Julia felt the balance of power in the room shifting, her authority slipping through her fingers like sand. She knew she had to regain control, but she also knew that losing her temper would only make things worse. "Can anyone give me an example of a symbol from a book or movie they'd read?" she asked, trying to redirect the class's focus. Several hands shot up, and Julia called on a student in the front row. "A rose as a symbol of love," the student offered. "Excellent," Julia said, forcing a smile. And why do you think the author chose a rose? As the student answered, Julia caught a flash of movement from the corner of her eye. Jamal's pen slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the desk before rolling to the floor. The sound was louder than it should have been in the otherwise quiet room, drawing a few snickers from the students nearby. Julia turned slowly, her eyes locking on Jamal. He met her gaze with an infuriatingly calm expression, his smirk still in place. Her fingers tightened around the marker in her hand as a wave of frustration washed over her. "Jamal," she said, her voice dangerously low, "is there something you'd like to share with the class?" Jamal leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. "No, Miss Carter," he said innocently, "just trying to keep up with the lesson." The room erupted in quiet laughter, and Julia felt her composure slipping. She took a step closer to Jamal's desk, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. The students fell silent, sensing the tension. "Disruptions like this are unacceptable," Julia said, her voice shaking slightly with suppressed anger. "You may think this is funny, but you're wasting not only your time but everyone else's as well." Jamal's smirk faltered for the first time, replaced by a flicker of surprise. But before he could respond, the bell rang, signaling the end of the period. Students began gathering their things, their chatter filling the room once more. Julia stood frozen at the front of the classroom, her heart pounding. She had maintained control for now. But as Jamal slung his backpack over one shoulder and walked toward the door, she caught the faintest trace of a smile returning to his face. As the room emptied, Julia sank into her chair, her hands trembling slightly. The pen incident had been minor in the grand scheme of things, but it felt like a crack in her carefully constructed authority. She knew she couldn't let it happen again. Tomorrow, she would be ready. Tomorrow, she would show Jamal Johnson that she was in charge. But what Julia didn't know was that tomorrow would bring challenges far greater than a spinning pen. Challenges that would force her to confront not only her authority, but also her own values and the buried secrets of Lincoln High. The breaking point. The next day began with the deceptive calm of any typical school morning. The rising sun cast golden hues across the rows of lockers and classrooms as students streamed into the building. Teachers carried their steaming coffee mugs and stacks of papers, exchanging brief pleasantries before diving into the day's grind. But for Julia Carter, calm was an illusion, a fragile facade ready to shatter. Julia arrived at her classroom earlier than usual, determined to take control of the day before it took control of her. She had spent the previous evening reviewing her lesson plans, rehearsing responses to potential disruptions, and even preparing alternative activities to keep students engaged. Today's topic, symbolism in modern media, was one of her favorites, and she wasn't going to let anything derail it. By the time the bell rang for third period, Julia was standing at her desk, every inch of her exuding poise and authority. She greeted her students as they entered, her sharp gaze sweeping over them, searching for any signs of trouble. When Jamal Johnson sauntered in, his pen already spinning effortlessly between his fingers, Julia's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Good afternoon, class," she began, her voice steady. "Today we'll analyze symbolism in modern media, focusing on how visual and narrative elements convey deeper meanings." The students settled into their seats, and for the first 15 minutes, everything went smoothly. Julia introduced the concept with a series of slides, showing examples from popular movies and TV shows. The class responded well, nodding along and even offering a few thoughtful comments. Then the clicking began. It was subtle at first, a faint sound from the back of the room that barely registered over Julia's voice. But as the lecture continued, the clicking grew louder, more deliberate. Julia's eyes flicked toward Jamal, who was leaning back in his chair, his pen dancing between his fingers in a mesmerizing rhythm. The sound was like a needle pricking her composure, each click another jab at her authority. Julia paused mid-sentence, her eyes locking on Jamal. He didn't stop. If anything, his movements became more fluid, as if he were performing for an invisible audience. "Jamal," Julia said, her voice sharper than she intended. "Please stop." The pen froze mid-spin, and Jamal looked up, feigning innocence. "Stop what, Miss Carter?" The room fell silent. All eyes were on them now, the air thick with anticipation. Julia took a deep breath, forcing a calm she didn't feel. "Stop spinning your pen. It's distracting." Jamal shrugged, setting the pen down on his desk with exaggerated care. "Sure thing, Miss Carter." Satisfied, Julia turned back to the board, picking up her marker to continue the lesson. But before she could speak, the clicking resumed. It was louder this time, more deliberate. A few students stifled giggles, their eyes darting between Julia and Jamal. Julia turned slowly, her grip on the marker tightening. "Jamal," she said, her voice trembling with barely contained frustration, "I ask you to stop." Jamal leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "I did stop. But then I started again." His tone was calm, almost casual, but the glint in his eyes betrayed the challenge behind his words. The class erupted in quiet laughter, and Julia felt the last threads of her patience snapping. Her vision tunneled, focusing solely on Jamal and the maddening smirk on his face. Without thinking, she strode toward his desk, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "You think this is a joke?" she demanded, her voice rising. "You think disrupting this class is funny?" Jamal met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I'm just bored, Miss Carter. Maybe you should make the lesson more interesting." The words hit her like a slap. The class fell into stunned silence, the laughter dying instantly. Julia's hand trembled at her side, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. In that moment, all the frustration, the exhaustion, the pressure she felt to maintain control came crashing down. Her hand moved before her mind could stop it. The slap echoed through the room, sharp and shocking. Jamal's head jerked to the side, his cheek blooming red where Julia's hand had struck him. The students gasped in unison, their wide eyes darting between Jamal and Julia. For a moment, everything was still. Julia stared at her hand, horrified by what she'd just done. Jamal turned back to her slowly, his expression calm but his eyes burning with something unspoken. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until the bell rang, shattering the moment. The students began gathering their things, their movements hesitant and unsure. Julia stood frozen at the front of the room, her mind racing. What had she done? How could she fix this? Jamal rose from his seat, slinging his backpack over one shoulder. His cheek was still red, the outline of her hand stark against his skin. He glanced at Julia one last time before walking toward the door, his steps measured and deliberate. The classroom emptied, the students filing out quietly, their usual chatter replaced by a tense, uncomfortable silence. When the last student was gone, Julia sank into her chair, her head in her hands. Her fingers trembled as she tried to steady her breathing, but the weight of what she'd done pressed down on her like a boulder. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and she knew, deep down, that the consequences would be far-reaching. But as the afternoon sunlight slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the empty desks, Julia couldn't focus on the consequences. All she could think about was the look in Jamal's eyes as he walked out of the room. It wasn't anger or fear. It was something far more unsettling. It was disappointment. Julia sat at her desk, the classroom now eerily quiet. Her hand still tingled from the slap, the phantom sting a constant reminder of her lapse in control. Her mind churned with a chaotic mix of guilt, fear, and disbelief. She had prided herself on being a fair and composed educator, yet here she was, someone who had let her emotions get the better of her. The muffled sounds of the school carried on outside her door. Laughter and conversation floated through the hallway, oblivious to the storm brewing in Julia's mind. She glanced at the clock. Fourth period would start in a few minutes, and the thought of facing another class filled her with dread. How could she teach when all she wanted to do was rewind time and undo her mistake? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Julia's heart leaped into her throat. She froze, staring at the door as if it were a portal to her worst fears. After a moment, the door creaked open, and Mr. Harris, the school's janitor, stepped inside. His weathered face was kind, but his eyes held a hint of concern. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice low, "you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Julia forced a tight smile. "I'm fine, Mr. Harris. Just a rough class." He nodded knowingly, leaning on the handle of his mop. "Kids can be a handful sometimes. Don't let 'em get to you." Julia nodded, murmuring a weak thank you as Mr. Harris turned and left, his footsteps fading down the hallway. She let out a shaky breath and turned her attention to her lesson plans, trying to push the incident out of her mind. But the image of Jamal's face, the redness of his cheek, and the steady, unreadable gaze he had given her refused to fade. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Julia moved through her classes mechanically, her usual enthusiasm replaced by a forced professionalism. Her students seemed to sense the change, their questions fewer, their interactions more subdued. By the time the final bell rang, Julia felt drained, the weight of the day pressing heavily on her shoulders. She was gathering her things, preparing to leave, when her classroom door swung open again. This time, it wasn't Mr. Harris. It was Principal Terrence Johnson. Terrence Johnson was a towering man with a commanding presence. His neatly trimmed beard and sharp suit gave him an air of authority that made even the most unruly students fall in line. But it was his calm demeanor and unwavering fairness that had earned him the respect of both students and staff. "Miss Carter," he said, his deep voice measured, "do you have a moment?" Julia's heart raced as she nodded, gesturing for him to sit. He closed the door behind him and took a seat across from her desk. His expression was unreadable, but Julia could see the tension in his posture. "I heard there was an incident in your class today," he began, folding his hands on the desk. "Would you like to tell me what happened?" Julia swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry. She had known this conversation was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. "There was a disruption," she said carefully. "A student was being disrespectful and disruptive, and I lost my temper." Terrence raised an eyebrow. "Lost your temper?" Julia hesitated, the words catching in her throat. Finally, she nodded. "I slapped him." The room fell silent. Terrence didn't move, his eyes fixed on hers. The weight of his gaze made Julia feel small, like a child caught in a lie. "I see," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. "And that student was Jamal Johnson." Julia's eyes widened in surprise. You know." Terrence nodded slowly. "Jamal is my son." The air seemed to leave the room. Julia stared at him, her mind racing. How had she not known? The resemblance was obvious now that she thought about it. The same sharp features, the same calm, piercing gaze. She felt a wave of nausea rise in her stomach. "I didn't realize," she began, but Terrence held up a hand to stop her. "That doesn't change what happened," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "What I need to know now is why." Julia hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "He was disrupting the class," she said finally, clicking his pen, making comments, distracting the other students. "I tried to address it calmly, but he wouldn't stop. And then I lost control." Terrence studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, letting out a deep sigh. "I understand that teaching can be stressful," he said, "and I know that Jamal can be challenging at times. But what you did today crossed a line, Julia. Physical discipline has no place in this school, or any school for that matter." Julia nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I know. I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me." Terrence's gaze softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. "I appreciate your honesty. But this isn't something we can sweep under the rug. There will be an investigation, and we'll need to notify Jamal's mother." Julia felt her stomach drop. "Of course," she said quietly. "I understand." Terrence stood, his towering presence even more imposing now. "For now, I need you to take the rest of the week off. Use that time to reflect on what happened and prepare for the discussions that will follow." Julia nodded, her hands trembling as she gathered her things. As Terrence turned to leave, he paused at the door, looking back at her. "Julia," he said, his voice softer now, "Jamal is a good kid. He's smart, curious, and independent, but he's also been through a lot. If you're willing to listen, you might learn something from him." With that, he left, leaving Julia alone in the silent classroom. She sank back into her chair, tears streaming down her face, as the weight of the day finally overwhelmed her. As Julia drove home that evening, the city lights blurred through her tears. She couldn't stop thinking about what Terrence had said, about Jamal's calm defiance, and the pain she had seen in his eyes. She had failed, not just as a teacher, but as a human being. She didn't know how she would face Jamal, or Terrence, or even herself. But she knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. The fallout from her actions would force her to confront not only her own mistakes, but also the deeper issues that had led her to this point. And for the first time in her career, Julia wasn't sure if she was ready. The truth beneath the surface. The morning after her meeting with Principal Johnson dawned gray and cold, mirroring the unease that had settled in Julia Carter's chest. Her hands gripped the steering wheel as she parked outside her modest suburban home. The usually comforting sound of the neighborhood kids playing outside grated against her nerves. The house felt too quiet when she stepped inside, the air heavy with her lingering thoughts. She dropped her bag by the door, its weight forgotten, and sank onto the couch, her hands trembling as she cradled her face. The events of the previous day looped endlessly in her mind: the slap, the stunned silence of her students, and the revelation that Jamal was Principal Johnson's son. Her world had shifted in an instant, and now, standing at the edge of an abyss of consequences, Julia couldn't escape the sinking feeling that she had barely scratched the surface of a much larger story. At Lincoln High, the hallways were alive with whispers. Word of the incident between Jamal and Miss Carter had spread like wildfire. Students who had been in the room recounted the event with dramatic embellishments, each retelling more vivid than the last. Teachers exchanged furtive glances in the staff room, their conversations punctuated by awkward silences whenever Julia's name was mentioned. Jamal, however, walked through the chaos with the same calm demeanor that had unnerved Julia in the first place. His cheek still bore a faint redness from the slap, but he showed no signs of anger or embarrassment. If anything, he seemed even more composed than usual, as if the incident had only solidified his resolve. In the cafeteria, his usual table was crowded with friends and curious onlookers. Malik and Chris flanked him, their expressions a mix of outrage and concern. "She's got to be fired for this," Malik said, his voice low but fierce. "What kind of teacher hits a kid?" Chris nodded, his usual laid-back demeanor replaced by a rare seriousness. "Yeah, Jay, you can't just let this slide." Jamal leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "I'm not letting it slide," he said calmly. "But I'm not rushing into anything, either." Malik threw up his hands. "Man, you're too chill about this. If it were me, my mom would have already sued the school." Chris smirked. "We know, Malik. You'd probably have a lawyer on speed dial." Jamal's lips twitched into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "This isn't just about me," he said quietly. "It's bigger than that." His friends exchanged puzzled looks, but Jamal didn't elaborate. He had spent the night thinking, piecing together fragments of conversations and observations that had nagged at him for weeks. Something about Miss Carter's reaction, the way her face had crumpled with regret even before her hand had landed, suggested a deeper story. And Jamal, always curious, couldn't ignore it. Meanwhile, Julia sat at her dining table, staring at her laptop. The email she had received the night before still lingered in her inbox, the subject line a stark accusation. "We know what you did." She had read the message a dozen times, her stomach twisting with each pass. The email was unsigned, its sender anonymous, but the words were clear. Someone had seen her slap Jamal, and they were prepared to take action. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she considered her response. Should she report the email to the school, confront Principal Johnson, or simply ignore it and hope it would go away? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing. It was a message from an unknown number. Julia's chest tightened as she read the words. Meet me at Lincoln Park, 6 p.m. We need to talk about what happened. No name, no context, but Julia's instincts told her it wasn't a coincidence. At 6 p.m. sharp, Julia found herself standing in the middle of Lincoln Park. The air was crisp, and the faint hum of traffic in the distance provided a backdrop to the rustling leaves. She clutched her coat tightly around her, her eyes scanning the park for any sign of the mysterious sender. Miss Carter. The voice came from behind her. Julia turned sharply to see Jamal standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets. He wore a gray hoodie and jeans, his posture relaxed, but his expression unreadable. Jamal. Julia's voice wavered with a mix of confusion and relief. What are you doing here? He shrugged, stepping closer. I'm the one who sent the message. Julia blinked, her mind racing. You? But why? Jamal met her gaze, his eyes steady. Because I need to understand why you did it, why you lost control like that. Julia felt her breath catch. She had expected anger, confrontation, perhaps even threats. But Jamal's calm, direct question disarmed her. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. She faltered, struggling to find the words. I don't know, Jamal. I wish I could tell you. It wasn't about you. It was everything. The stress, the pressure, the fear of losing control. And you pushed just enough to make me snap. Jamal studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. Fair enough. But there's more to it, isn't there? Julia frowned, her brow furrowing. What do you mean? Jamal leaned against a nearby bench, his posture casual but his tone sharp. You're hiding something. I've seen it before. The way people carry things they don't want anyone else to see. And I think whatever you're carrying is part of why you snapped. Julia felt her stomach twist. She had spent years burying the pain and regret of her past, building a fortress of professionalism around herself to keep the memories at bay. But now, faced with Jamal's quiet determination, she felt the cracks in her armor widening. I don't know what you're talking about, she said weakly, but the words rang hollow. Jamal didn't press further. Instead, he pushed off the bench and walked closer, his voice softer now. You're not the only one with a story, Miss Carter. People think I'm just some kid who likes to mess around, but they don't know what I've been through. My mom died when I was 9. My dad's been trying to raise me while running a school. And everywhere I go, people either pity me or expect me to fail. Julia's heart ached at his words. She had always seen Jamal as a challenge, a disruption to her carefully planned lessons. But now she saw him in a new light, a young man carrying burdens far heavier than his years. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I didn't know. Jamal shrugged. Not your fault. But if we're going to move past what happened, we both need to be honest. About everything. Julia looked at him, her mind racing. Could she trust him? Could she share the truth she had kept hidden for so long? The weight of her past pressed down on her, threatening to suffocate her. But as she met Jamal's steady gaze, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. I'll try, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. But it's not easy. Jamal nodded. It never is. As they stood together in the fading light of the park, an unspoken understanding passed between them. The road ahead would be difficult, fraught with challenges and revelations neither of them could predict. But for the first time, Julia felt a glimmer of possibility, that through honesty and accountability, they might both find a way to heal. Beneath the layers, The morning after their meeting in Lincoln Park, Julia awoke with a sense of unease and cautious determination. The conversation with Jamal had peeled back layers of her defenses, forcing her to confront emotions she had long buried. His words echoed in her mind, not just the pain of his past, but his sharp insight into hers. Julia knew he was right. There was more to her outburst than classroom stress, and if she didn't face it, the fallout would only grow. She spent the morning pacing her small living room, her thoughts a storm of guilt, fear, and a growing sense of urgency. The school had given her the rest of the week off to reflect, but she knew the real reason was to allow Principal Johnson time to conduct his investigation. The waiting was unbearable. Every minute that passed felt like another crack forming in the facade of her carefully constructed life. Julia pulled out an old photo album, something she hadn't touched in years. The worn leather cover creaked as she opened it, revealing faded photographs of a life she had tried to forget. There she was, a younger version of herself, smiling brightly in a classroom full of students. Back then, she had been a new teacher, full of hope and determination to make a difference. But then her gaze fell on another photo, a group picture from her second teaching assignment. Her smile was strained, her posture stiff. She remembered that year vividly, not for the lessons taught, but for the mistakes that had haunted her ever since. At Lincoln High, Jamal sat in his father's office, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. Principal Johnson leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he studied his son. Jamal had been called in for a formal statement, but this wasn't just about protocol. It was personal. "Tell me everything," his father said, his voice calm but firm. Jamal sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I already told you what happened. She slapped me, Dad. She lost it." Principal Johnson's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. Jamal continued, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "Look, I know I can be a pain sometimes. I push buttons. But this wasn't about me. Not really. Something else is going on with her." Terrence raised an eyebrow. "What makes you say that?" Jamal leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Because I saw it in her eyes. The second it happened, she looked broken. Like she wasn't even mad at me. She was mad at herself." Terrence sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. "That doesn't excuse her actions." "I'm not saying it does," Jamal said quickly. "But I think we need to figure out why it happened before we decide what to do about it." His father nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You've always been more perceptive than people give you credit for, Jamal." Jamal smirked. "Comes with the territory." Terrence smiled faintly, but the weight of the situation quickly returned. He picked up a file from his desk, flipping it open. "I've been reviewing her record. Miss Carter is a competent teacher, highly regarded, in fact, but there's a gap in her employment history, about 2 years long. No explanation in her file, no references for that time period." Jamal frowned. "You think it's connected?" Terrence closed the file and set it aside. "I don't know, but if there's something in her past that's affecting her now, we need to uncover it." That afternoon, Julia sat in her car outside the school parking lot, her fingers gripping the steering wheel. She had driven here impulsively, unable to shake the feeling that she needed to confront what was happening head-on. But now that she was here, she wasn't sure what to do. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from an unknown number. "Check the staff archives. You'll find what you're looking for." Julia's pulse quickened. She glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching her. But the parking lot was empty, the school looming silently in the afternoon sun. Who had sent the message? And what did they mean? Her curiosity outweighed her fear. She exited the car and walked toward the building, her heart pounding with each step. The hallways were eerily quiet, most of the staff having gone home for the day. She made her way to the administrative office, where the staff records were kept. Inside, the small room smelled of old paper and ink. Rows of filing cabinets lined the walls, each labeled meticulously. Julia hesitated, her fingers hovering over the drawer marked personnel records. She knew she shouldn't be here. This was a breach of protocol. But the text had planted a seed of doubt she couldn't ignore. She found her file easily, the tab marked Carter, Julia. Flipping it open, she scanned the pages, her eyes landing on the gap in her employment history. The 2 missing years stared back at her like an accusation. Looking for something. Julia spun around, the file clutched to her chest. Jamal stood in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, his expression calm but curious. "How did you?" Julia began, her voice faltering. "I followed you," Jamal said simply. "I figured you'd come here." Julia's shoulders sagged. "I shouldn't be here. I needed to know." Jamal stepped closer, his gaze steady. "What's in the file?" Julia hesitated, then handed it to him. "A gap," she said quietly. 2 years where I wasn't teaching." Jamal flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing. "Why?" Julia looked away, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I was fired." Jamal's head snapped up. "Fired? For what?" Julia swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. "For losing control. For hitting another student." The words hung in the air, heavy with shame. Julia couldn't meet Jamal's eyes, the weight of her confession pressing down on her like a stone. "It was my first teaching job," she continued, her voice trembling. "I was young, inexperienced, and overwhelmed. One of my students was struggling, acting out. I thought I could handle it, but I couldn't. I snapped, and I've regretted it every day since." Jamal was silent, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. "And now it's happening again." Julia nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I had moved past it. I thought I was better. But clearly I'm not." Jamal set the file down and crossed his arms. "So what are you going to do about it?" Julia looked at him, her eyes red and swollen. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I want to make it right. I need to make it right." Jamal nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "Then start by being honest. With me, with my dad, with yourself. Because if you don't face this head on, it's just going to keep happening." Julia took a deep breath, his words sinking in. He was right. She had spent years running from her past, but now it was time to stop. Time to take responsibility. Time to rebuild, one step at a time. As Jamal left the room, Julia stared at the file in her hands. The truth was out now, and there was no going back. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. She had a long road ahead, but she wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to heal. Julia sat alone in the dimly lit records room, her mind reeling. The confession she had just made to Jamal felt like both a burden lifted and a new weight pressing down on her shoulders. She couldn't believe she had shared the truth of her past, let alone with Jamal Johnson, the very student whose trust she had shattered just days ago. The silence of the room was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above. Her gaze fell back to her personnel file. The 2 missing years loomed like an accusation, but this time she didn't avert her eyes. Instead, she flipped through the file again, lingering on the termination letter from her first school. The language was clinical and cold. Failure to maintain professional boundaries and uphold the standards of a safe learning environment. Julia winced. The words had haunted her for years, their weight growing heavier with time. She had spent so long trying to outrun them, to build a new life where her past didn't define her. But now, sitting in this quiet room with her file in one hand and her heart on her sleeve, Julia realized she couldn't run anymore. Meanwhile, Jamal walked the empty hallways of Lincoln High, his mind churning. He hadn't expected Miss Carter to open up to him, let alone reveal something so deeply personal. For the first time, he saw her not as the rigid perfectionist teacher who had slapped him, but as a flawed human being struggling to keep it all together. He made his way to his father's office, pausing outside the door. Principal Johnson's voice carried through the door, firm but calm as always. Jamal knocked twice before stepping inside. "Jamal," his father said, looking up from a stack of papers. Everything okay? Jamal closed the door behind him, his expression serious. We need to talk about Miss Carter. Terrence leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. Go on. She told me why she snapped. Jamal began, his voice steady. She's done this before. At her last school. She said she was fired for hitting a student. Terrence's face remained unreadable, but his eyes narrowed slightly. Did she say why? Jamal nodded. She said she was young and overwhelmed. She made a mistake, and she's been trying to move past it ever since. But it's still following her, even now. Terrence was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the papers in front of him. Finally, he spoke. That's significant, Jamal. It doesn't excuse what she did, but it gives us context. We need to decide how to handle this carefully. Jamal stepped closer, his voice gaining urgency. Dad, I don't think firing her is the answer. She's not a bad person. She's just carrying a lot. Terrence looked up, his eyes locking with his son's. And you think she can change? Jamal hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, I do. But only if we give her the chance. Terrence sighed, rubbing his temples. This isn't just about her, Jamal. It's about the school, the students, and our responsibility to provide a safe environment. If I let this slide, what kind of message does that send? Jamal crossed his arms. It's not about letting it slide. It's about addressing the root cause. She needs help, not punishment. If we just fire her, we're pushing her problems onto someone else. And what happens if this happens again at another school? Terrence studied his son, a flicker of pride in his eyes. You've given this a lot of thought. Jamal shrugged. I've had time. Terrence leaned forward, his tone softening. I'll take your perspective into account, Jamal. But this isn't a decision I can make lightly. There are protocols we need to follow. Jamal nodded. I get it. Just don't write her off. She's not a lost cause. The following day, Julia received an email from Principal Johnson. The subject line was simple: meeting request. Her heart sank as she read the message. The meeting was scheduled for the next morning, and the tone of the email was professional and to the point. Julia spent the rest of the day in a haze, alternating between preparing her defense and imagining every worst-case scenario. By the time she went to bed, her nerves were frayed, and sleep felt like a distant dream. When the morning arrived, Julia dressed carefully, choosing a plain blouse and slacks that conveyed professionalism without drawing attention. She arrived at the school early, her palms clammy as she made her way to Principal Johnson's office. Come in, his deep voice called when she knocked. Julia stepped inside, her stomach twisting as she saw both Terrence and Jamal seated at the small conference table. Jamal's presence surprised her, but his expression was calm, almost reassuring. Miss Carter, Terrence began, gesturing for her to sit. Thank you for coming. Julia nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She sat across from them, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I want to start by acknowledging the seriousness of what happened, Terrence said, his tone measured. Physical discipline is unacceptable in any circumstance, and as the principal, it's my duty to ensure the safety and well-being of every student. Julia nodded again, her eyes fixed on the table. However, Terrence continued, after speaking with Jamal and reviewing your record, I believe there's an opportunity for growth here, for you and for us as a school. Julia's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. What do you mean? Terrence leaned forward, his gaze steady. I'm not going to terminate your employment, but there will be conditions. You'll need to attend counseling sessions to address the underlying issues that led to your actions. Additionally, we'll set up regular evaluations to ensure this doesn't happen again. Julia blinked, tears welling in her eyes. You're giving me another chance. Terrence nodded. Everyone deserves the opportunity to learn from their mistakes. But understand that this is your last chance. There won't be a second one. Julia swallowed hard, her voice trembling. Thank you. I won't let you down. Jamal, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "Miss Carter, I know this isn't easy for you, but I think you're stronger than you give yourself credit for." Julia looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Jamal, for everything." As she left the office, a sense of relief and determination washed over her. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, Julia felt like she had the support she needed to face her past and build a better future. Rebuilding bridges. The next few weeks felt like walking a tightrope for Julia Carter. Her days were filled with a new sense of purpose, but also an undercurrent of tension as she navigated her second chance at Lincoln High. Principal Johnson's conditions were clear, and Julia was determined to meet them, not just to keep her job, but to prove to herself that she could change. One of the first steps was her mandatory counseling sessions. Julia had always been skeptical of therapy, dismissing it as unnecessary or impractical. But sitting across from Dr. Elaine Rivers, a calm and empathetic woman with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through her defenses, Julia realized how much she had been holding back. "So, Miss Carter," Dr. Rivers began during their first session, her voice warm but firm, "tell me about the slap." Julia flinched at the directness of the question. I don't know what came over me," she stammered. "It was like everything I've been holding in just exploded." Dr. Rivers nodded thoughtfully, jotting something down in her notebook. "And what have you been holding in?" Julia hesitated. "Stress, pressure, expectations. I want to be the best teacher I can be, but sometimes it feels like I'm drowning. And Jamal, he pushed me in ways I wasn't prepared for." "Jamal is a factor," Dr. Rivers agreed, "but he's not the root cause. Let's dig deeper. What are you really afraid of, Julia?" The question hung in the air, and Julia felt a lump rise in her throat. For so long, she had pushed away the memories of her past, burying them under layers of professionalism and perfectionism. But now, faced with Dr. Rivers' patient gaze, she couldn't avoid the truth. "I'm afraid of failing," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "of losing control, of becoming the person I was when I hit that first student." Dr. Rivers leaned forward slightly. "And who was that person?" Julia's hands trembled as she tried to put it into words. She was scared, inexperienced. She thought she could handle everything on her own. And when she couldn't, she lashed out. "I spent years trying to bury her, but she's still there." Dr. Rivers offered a small, understanding smile. "The first step to change is acknowledging what's holding you back. You're not that person anymore, Julia. But you need to forgive yourself for being her." While Julia worked through her internal struggles, the dynamics at Lincoln High began to shift. Students whispered about the slap less frequently, their attention drifting to the latest school gossip. But for Jamal, the incident remained fresh in his mind. He couldn't ignore the red mark it had left, not just on his cheek, but on his understanding of authority, respect, and forgiveness. Jamal surprised himself by stepping into a role he hadn't expected. An advocate for Miss Carter. He didn't excuse what she had done, but he spoke up when other students made disparaging remarks about her. "She's trying to make things right," he told Malik and Chris one afternoon in the cafeteria. "That's more than most people would do." Malik, ever the skeptic, raised an eyebrow. "You seriously think she deserves a second chance after what she did?" Chris shrugged. "Maybe. I mean, she didn't try to cover it up or make excuses. That's something, right?" Jamal nodded. "Exactly. Everyone screws up. It's what you do after that counts." His friends exchanged glances but didn't push further. Jamal's quiet confidence often had a way of settling arguments before they could escalate. In the classroom, Julia began to rebuild her relationships with her students. It wasn't easy. Many of them still regarded her with a mix of wariness and curiosity, unsure whether to trust her again. But Julia was patient. She incorporated more interactive activities into her lessons, encouraging discussion and collaboration rather than strict lectures. One day, during a group project on symbolism in film, Julia noticed Jamal working with a few classmates in the back of the room. He was animated, his hands gesturing as he explained his interpretation of a scene from a popular movie. Julia approached cautiously, not wanting to disrupt the flow. "Interesting choice," she said, glancing at their poster. "Why did you pick that scene?" Jamal looked up, his expression neutral. "Because it shows how the character's actions don't match his words. He says he's fine, but everything he does says otherwise. Kind of like." He trailed off, and Julia felt a pang of understanding. "Kind of like people who pretend they have it all together," she offered gently. Jamal's lips quirked into a faint smile. "Yeah, something like that." For the first time since the incident, Julia felt a small spark of connection with Jamal. It wasn't forgiveness. She knew that would take time. But it was a step in the right direction. Outside of school, Julia began attending local community events, hoping to immerse herself in the broader fabric of Lincoln High's diverse and vibrant community. At one such event, a career day hosted by the school, she was surprised to see Jamal and his father giving a presentation together. Terrence spoke first, his authoritative voice commanding the room. "Education isn't just about academics. It's about character, resilience, and the ability to learn from failure." Jamal followed, his voice steady but more personal. "I've learned that even when people let you down, it doesn't mean they're bad. It means they're human. And sometimes, they just need someone to believe in them." Julia felt her throat tighten as she listened. Jamal's words weren't directed at her, but she couldn't ignore their relevance. She had let him down, and yet here he was, demonstrating a maturity and grace that humbled her. After the event, Julia approached Jamal and Terrence, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "That was an incredible presentation," she said. "You both have a way with words." Terrence smiled warmly. "Thank you, Miss Carter. I think Jamal gets his eloquence from his mother." Jamal chuckled softly, but didn't say anything. Julia hesitated, then turned to Jamal. "I just wanted to say, thank you for giving me a chance to fix things. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful." Jamal met her gaze, his expression thoughtful. "It's not about deserving it. It's about what you do with it." As the weeks turned into months, Julia continued to grow, both as a teacher and as a person. The counseling sessions helped her confront her past, and her renewed commitment to her students began to rebuild their trust. Jamal remained a quiet but steady presence, challenging her in ways that forced her to be better. By the end of the semester, Julia felt a sense of hope she hadn't experienced in years. She still had a long way to go, but for the first time, she believed she could get there. And as she stood in her classroom, watching her students pack up for the holidays, she realized that second chances weren't just about redemption. They were about transformation. Redemption in action. The final weeks of the semester arrived, bringing with them the frenetic energy of exams, project deadlines, and the anticipation of winter break. For Julia Carter, these weeks were more than just a conclusion to the school year. They marked a turning point in her journey as a teacher, a colleague, and a person. Lincoln High's annual Winter Showcase was fast approaching, an event that celebrated the school's diversity and creativity. Students prepared performances, displays, and presentations that reflected their talents and passions. For Julia, it was an opportunity to connect with her students in a way she hadn't before, by helping them tell their own stories. Her classroom buzzed with activity as students brainstormed ideas for their showcase projects. Julia had assigned a theme: symbolism in our lives, encouraging her students to explore how objects, places, or moments in their lives held deeper meanings. "Miss Carter," Malik called from the back of the room, waving a hand in the air. "What if my symbol is my Xbox? Does that work?" Julia smiled, her first instinct to roll her eyes tempered by her commitment to fostering engagement. "That depends, Malik. What does your Xbox symbolize for you?" Malik grinned. "Victory. Hours of hard-earned victory." The class chuckled, and Julia joined them. "If you can present that in a meaningful way, I'll allow it." Jamal, seated in his usual spot in the back, raised an eyebrow at her response. He had been unusually quiet since the project was announced, his notebook mostly blank. Julia noticed but didn't push. She had learned that Jamal worked at his own pace, often surprising her with the depth of his insights when he finally shared them. The day of the winter showcase arrived with an air of excitement. The school gymnasium had been transformed into a vibrant exhibition space, with student artwork lining the walls, a stage set up for performances, and rows of tables displaying projects. Parents, teachers, and community members milled about, admiring the work of Lincoln High's students. Julia walked among the exhibits, pausing to chat with her students and admire their projects. Malik's presentation, complete with a hand-drawn poster of an Xbox controller and an enthusiastic explanation of gaming as a metaphor for perseverance, drew laughs and applause. Julia gave him an encouraging thumbs up, proud of the way he had taken her challenge seriously. She was making her way toward the stage when she saw Jamal standing near his display. His project was simple: a single wooden box, roughly the size of a shoebox, placed on a small table. Above it, a sign read, "The box I carry." Intrigued, Julia approached. Jamal noticed her and gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. A few other students and parents lingered nearby, curious about the enigmatic display. "Do you mind if I take a look?" Julia asked gently. Jamal shrugged. "Go ahead. That's what it's here for." Julia opened the box slowly, her breath catching as she saw its contents. Inside were a collection of objects: a photo of Jamal with his parents, a dog tag, a small trophy, and a folded piece of paper. Each item seemed ordinary at first glance, but Julia knew better. "These are your symbols," she said softly. Jamal nodded. "Yeah, each one represents something I've been through, something I carry with me every day." Julia looked at him, her heart swelling with admiration. "Would you tell me about them?" Jamal hesitated, then gestured for her to follow him a few steps away from the crowd. He pointed to the photo first. "That's me with my mom and dad, back before my mom passed. It's a reminder of what I've lost, but also what I still have. My dad's done everything he can to keep us going." Julia nodded, her chest tightening. "The dog tag," Jamal continued, "belonged to my uncle. He was in the military. He used to tell me stories about what it meant to fight for something bigger than yourself. He died when I was 12. Julia felt tears prick her eyes, but she kept her composure. "The trophy," Jamal said with a faint smile, "is from middle school. Science fair. It was the first time I realized I could be good at something if I put my mind to it." Finally, he picked up the folded piece of paper and handed it to her. Julia unfolded it carefully, revealing a poem written in neat, deliberate handwriting. The words were raw, honest, and deeply personal, describing the weight of expectations, the fear of failure, and the resilience needed to keep going. "I wrote that after everything that happened in your class," Jamal said quietly. "It's about carrying the weight but not letting it crush you." Julia's voice caught in her throat. "Jamal, this is incredible." He shrugged, his calm demeanor betraying a hint of vulnerability. "It's just my way of processing things." Julia handed the poem back, her hands trembling slightly. "Thank you for sharing this with me. It means more than you know." Later that evening, the showcase culminated in a series of performances on the stage. Julia sat in the audience, watching with pride as her students sang, danced, and presented their projects. When Jamal took the stage, carrying his wooden box, the room fell silent. He placed the box on a small table and addressed the crowd. "This box represents the things I carry every day: memories, losses, victories, and fears. It's heavy sometimes, but it's also what makes me who I am." He opened the box and began to explain each item, much as he had to Julia. The audience listened intently, captivated by his honesty and the power of his story. When he finished, the room erupted into applause. Julia felt tears streaming down her face, but this time they were tears of pride and hope. Jamal had turned his pain into something beautiful, something meaningful. And in doing so, he had reminded her of why she had become a teacher in the first place. As the showcase ended and the crowd began to disperse, Julia found herself standing near the stage, watching Jamal pack up his project. She approached him, her steps hesitant. "You were amazing up there," she said. "You have a gift, Jamal." He looked up, his expression softening. "Thanks. I just wanted to share my story." Julia hesitated, then added, "You've inspired me. Not just tonight, but every day since the incident. I've learned so much from you." Jamal smiled faintly. "It goes both ways, Miss Carter. You've shown me that even when people mess up, they can still make things right." As they stood together in the quiet gymnasium, Julia felt a sense of closure and a renewed sense of purpose. The road to redemption had been long and difficult, but it had also been worth it. Through honesty, accountability, and the courage to face their own flaws, she and Jamal had found a way to move forward, together.